Hello, and welcome to Principles of ATATURK and History of Turkish Revolution course. In this program, we'll talk about the Tanzîmât reforms. Within this context, we'll discuss the Gülhane Decree and the reforms, 19th century Ottoman economy, the Crimean War, the Ferman of Concessions, Ottomanism, and finally, print media and the young Ottomans before the first constitutional era. In the previous program, we talked about the Ottoman defeat against Egyptian forces at the Battle of Nizip. This defeat came after Sultan Mahmud II's death in 1839. Abdülmecid came to power and continued reforms. Abdülmecid's efforts produced Tanzîmât, which means ordering, regulating, or restructuring. During the Tanzîmât period, Sultan Abdülmecid, Sultan Abdülaziz, and Sultan Murad V were in power. After the defeat at Nizip, the Gülhane Decree was announced to get the European powers' support. Also, the Ottoman state wanted to prevent foreign powers' intervention in domestic affairs to solve the treasury crisis and to foster Ottoman patriotism by uniting people under the ideology of Ottomanism. The Gülhane Decree promised to guarantee the life, honor, and property of the Ottoman subjects, to treat all subjects equally, to make all trials public and just, and to adopt an equal taxation system for all the subjects. Under this reform program, the power shifted from the palace to Sublime Porte, that is, Baba Ali, which represented the Ottoman government. New councils were created as well. For example, in addition to Supreme Council of Judicial Ordinances, Supreme Council of Reforms was founded. Later, Council of State was formed with Christian and Muslim members and covered both legislative functions and Court of Appeals. In the 1840s, administration was centralized through councils. Councils at county and provincial levels acted as representatives of the state. Local notables were given access to county councils, but because they had lost forced labor, the Tanzîmât reforms faced reaction in the Balkans. In the 1850s, centralization wasn't successful, so in 1864, a hierarchical system in the provinces was introduced with the provincial law. According to this law, provinces were organized as province, county, district, rural community, and village. In 1871, 27 provinces were designed and discontinued until 1913. As for military reforms, the name of the army was changed to Nizamiye. For the sake of equality, both Muslims and Christians were subjected to conscription. Later, Christians were excluded and they paid a special tax called Bedeli Askeri. The military service wasn't compulsory for the residents of Istanbul and nomads. As part of the reforms, military obligation was defined to be 4 years. Tanzîmât reforms brought significant changes in the Ottoman legal system. A new penal code was introduced. It meant equality between Muslims and non-Muslims under the law. Death penalty for Muslims giving up their beliefs was abolished. A new commercial and maritime law were passed. Foreigners were allowed to buy lands. Nizamiye courts were created and designed for criminal, civil, and commercial cases, and they served Muslims and non-Muslims alike. The religious law was codified and civil law of legal affairs was written. This civil code lasted until 1926. Now, let's have a look at the innovations in education. Through the creation of Council of Education, the Ministry of Education, and the Law of Education, a modern and secular education system was achieved. Until the Tanzîmât, there were children's schools, that is, Sıbyan Mektebi, for primary education, which was based on the teachings of the Quran. In this period, Rüşdiye schools were established. Rüşdiye had a 2-year education after Sıbyan Mektebi, and it aimed to prepare students for further education like military academy and the medical school. İdadi schools, on the other hand, were established to serve 2 purposes: to prepare students for higher education and to provide Muslim and non-Muslim students with intercultural understanding. Rüşdiye and İdadi schools required more teachers, so schools for teachers were also opened. Later, a new school called Sultani was established, and it modeled the French secondary schools. Galatasaray and Darüşşafaka were the first of these schools. In higher education, School of Medicine and School of Political Sciences were established. The graduates of these schools had a significant role in the future political and social development of the empire. The first real Ottoman university, however, was Darülfünun, which was opened in 1863 but lasted only about 8 years. Non-Muslims were also allowed to open their own schools. Notre Dame de Sion and Robert College were among these schools. As you can see, many educational reforms were introduced during this period to unify the nation and to promote Ottomanism. But these aims couldn't really be met because of the minority and missionary schools. So, how was the Ottoman economy during this period? In the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire became part of the world capitalist system with the disappearance of protectionist economy and the replacement of local bazaars by regional, national, and international markets. With liberal economic policies, the Ottomans imported colonial goods and exported foodstuffs and raw material. After 1850, they started to export manufactured goods as well. In trade, foreigners and Ottoman non-Muslims were advantageous because of the privileges they had. Ottoman Muslims, on the other hand, still dominated the trade in inland regions. When the steam engine began to be used in transportation, commercial and agricultural activities increased in Europe, and European merchants easily came to Ottoman lands to sell their products. With the opening of Suez Canal and the use of steamships, Iran, Iraq, and Arabia had advantages, but Damascus, Aleppo, Mosul, Beirut, and even Istanbul had economic losses. With modern tools, agricultural production increased, and this required wage labor. However, because of the cost of wage labor, landowners preferred sharecropping. Sharecropping meant farming the land in exchange of a portion of the crops. In terms of reforming the taxation system, tithe and service tax were maintained. The head tax taken from non-Muslims was abolished, but exemption tax from military started to be collected. The sheep tax was extended to all farm animals. A taxation of real property and income on a proportional basis was started. Tax collection system also changed. In 1840s, a direct taxation was adopted and salaried officials were appointed to collect taxes. These officials also told people about the Tanzîmât, created councils, registered taxpayers, and their properties. However, because they were not enough in number, the direct taxation failed and tax farming was brought back. In finance, one budget and one treasury policy was adopted, so multiple treasuries were abolished. The Ottoman Bank was established as a British enterprise, and there were other foreign banks and financial institutions founded during this period. As a result of the financial problems in the 19th century, paper currency was put into circulation in 1840. But because of the market crash of 1861 and counterfeiting, it was withdrawn from the market in 1862. The Ottoman Center officially borrowed money from outside sources during this period. High interest rates and the crisis in the world capitalist system made it impossible for the Ottoman state to pay its debts. What's more, in the 1870s, famine in Anatolia killed a large number of people and livestock. So, production and tax income decreased dramatically. As a result, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration was created as a consortium of foreign creditors. During the Tanzîmât era, the Ottomans had to cope with external problems too. One of them was the Crimean War, which broke out because of Russia's desire to protect the Orthodox Church and the Orthodox population of the Ottoman Empire. France and Britain supported the Ottomans, so Russia agreed to make peace, and the Treaty of Paris was signed. Among others, the most important result of this treaty was that the Ottoman Empire became part of the concert of Europe, so Ottoman territorial integrity was guaranteed. Imperial Decree was one of the results of the Crimean War. In addition to reaffirming the terms of the Gülhane Decree, it ended dhimmi status of non-Muslims, abolished head tax, and brought military exemption tax, gave non-Muslims the right to be educated in public schools and employed in state bureaucracy. Another important result of the Crimean War was that about 2.5 million Muslims in Crimea were forced to leave their lands. We have already mentioned that the second Ottoman Sultan in this period was Abdülaziz. After Abdülmecit's death, Abdülaziz continued reforms and declared the first Ottoman civil code. He had good relations with Europe, and he was the first Ottoman Sultan to visit Europe. During his reign, Ottomanism received more attention, but especially because of economic and financial problems, he was deposed by his ministers in 1876. So, how did Ottomanism emerge? After the Egyptian crisis, the Ottomans had local problems like sectarian conflict in Lebanon and Syria, crisis between Christians and Muslims in Crete, and nationalism in the Balkans. All these problems led the Ottoman ruling elite to introduce an official ideology known as Ottomanism to maintain unity under Ottoman citizenship. Because of different ethnic identities, Muslim refugees accepting Islamic identity, and pan-Slavism in the Balkans, Ottomanism failed to unite all the subjects in the empire. In the last part of this program, we'll talk about print media and the young Ottomans. Print media had already been present in the Ottoman lands before the Tanzîmât period. We can say that the actual beginning of the Ottoman press was in 1860s under the influence of French literature. İbrahim Şinasi, Ziya Pasha, and Namık Kemal were the major figures of this movement, and they influenced the start of the first privately owned newspaper, Tercüman-ı Ahval. By starting his own newspaper, Tasvir Efkar, Şinasi criticized the government and asked for reforms. Later, Namık Kemal took it over and criticized the government more radically. Namık Kemal's most important concepts were fatherland, liberty, and nation. Many other newspapers and journals were published in this period, so a law imposing strict rules to the press was passed. However, this didn't stop the journalists of the time to express their opposing ideas. It's important to note here that the first Turkish magazine for women and the first Turkish women's periodical with a female editor were published in this era. There were Turkish translations of the European works, but the first play written in Turkish was The Marriage of the Poet by Şinasi. The Romance of Talat and Fidnat was the first novel written by an Ottoman Muslim, Şemseddin Sami. And the Young Ottomans. The Young Ottomans emerged in the 1860s when Namık Kemal and some bureaucrats founded a secret society called Alliance of Patriotism. They aimed at preventing foreign intervention and finding a way to create a patriotic and constitutional parliamentary system. As the first modern ideological movement, the Young Ottomans affected the Turkish intelligentsia. They criticized the Tanzîmât statesmen, their policies in domestic industry, agriculture, taxation system, education, and transportation. They basically defended a written constitution, an elected government, and adoption of some European institutions. It was 1876 when Mithat Pasha wrote the first constitution with some young Ottomans like Namık Kemal and Ziya Pasha. The first constitutional era, however, didn't last long, and the young Ottomans either suffered imprisonment or death. In conclusion, the Tanzîmât reforms paved the way for the first Ottoman constitution, along with a parliamentary system. It can be said that the Tanzîmât period was a transition from the empire to the Republican Turkey. Well, this is the end of our program for Chapter 3. In this video, we've discussed the Tanzîmât reforms, 19th century Ottoman economy, the Crimean War, the Ferman of concessions, Ottomanism, print media, and the young Ottomans. Join us for the next program. Goodbye.